Great. Hey everyone, I am Sabrina, and among many other things, I am the creator of Chaos and Control, which is a documentary podcast series on the complex story of birth control in America. And over the next hour, we're going to talk about that story. We're going to get historical, we're going to get sociological, and we're going to step outside the dominant and very polarized perspectives of the pill. The false dichotomy where we have this really conservative, puritanical, anti-birth control propaganda on one side, and the feminist liberation, birth control support at all costs on the other, and zoom out and really look at how we got here and the things that have been left out of the conversation. So before we dive in, we are currently in a moment where the landscape of women's health is shifting, and the field of body literacy as a cohesive field is really being born. And shout out to Nicole for organizing this symposium. I need to be part of that. And as it's being born, we have a chance to shape it well. And so much of the wellness world in general is rife with a lot of appropriation and political bypassing, and especially recently, supremacist pipelines. And if we don't work with justice at the forefront, even as we turn away from the conventional medical system and change approaches and techniques, we can risk recreating some of the same systems of harm that we are seeking to remedy. So that's why before we go any further, I just want to ground this presentation in the idea of reproductive justice, which Carmen also spoke to in her session yesterday. If you don't know, reproductive justice is a framework and a movement that unites reproductive rights and social justice. And it holds that it is equally important to fight for and protect the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to birth and raise children in a safe and healthy environment. It was termed by Loretta Ross and developed by a caucus of Black feminists who came together in Chicago in 1994 to form the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice Coalition. And importantly, reproductive justice takes us beyond the conversation of whether hormonal birth control is good or bad. And grounding in reproductive justice means taking a holistic, historically and politically aware approach. And it means taking into account the equally important needs to end coerced reproduction, forced sterilization and termination, and violent birthing practices, as well as the systems that shape the environments in which people give birth and raise children. It goes beyond abortion and contraception, illuminating how the criminal justice system, the immigration system, the food systems, and really all of the systems we live within are deeply intertwined with body literacy and with all of our work. And from there, we can truly work to build a reproductive future which is liberatory for everyone. So a lot of the debates around hormonal birth control revolves around the pill. And as we'll get into later, the pill was the first form of hormonal birth control from which the implant, the patch, the shot, the IUD all emerged. The dominant understanding of the pill is that it was a great liberator of women, that for the first time ever, it allowed women to take control of their reproductive lives. In October of 2023, Axios published an article titled, "What's Driving More Women to Quit Birth Control?" It opens by saying, at the same time the fall of Roe v. Wade has fueled an interest in expanding contraceptive access, OBGYNs say they have seen a wave of patients quitting hormonal birth control for more quote-unquote natural options. The article notes that the turn against effective forms of birth control raises concerns about increased risks for unplanned pregnancies when abortion access is becoming increasingly limited. And the idea that birth control skepticism is antithetical to reproductive rights was also echoed in a recent Vogue article titled "The Anti-Birth Control Movement is the New Anti-Abortion Movement." Similarly, a 2023 Glamour article titled "Birth Control TikTok is unsurprisingly, a hotbed of misinformation, criticized the rise in social media content critiquing the pill and promoting fertility awareness, contending that it's dangerous to be talking about these things on social media and in a landscape where abortion access is increasingly under threat. And then more recently, a couple months ago, the New York Times published an expose on the Maha-fueled rise of natural family planning, writing that quotes, "A growing coalition of conservatives are speaking out against hormonal birth control while promoting a more, quote, natural alternative." And again, articles like these conflate any birth control criticism with conservatism. And I bring them up at the start here because they really reflect the broader cultural conversation happening around birth control. But importantly, these narratives are built off the assumption that birth control equals liberation, and that assumption isn't quite true. The idea that contraception started with the pill and with modern medicine is a myth. And in reality, women have been more or less effectively managing their fertility for nearly as long as they've been having babies. Women have used a variety of methods throughout history, from withdrawal and forms of cycle tracking to internal and external herbal preparations to barrier methods. And on the screen here, you'll see just a couple of the many examples. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical papyrus of herbal knowledge dating to circa 1550 BCE, mentions several birth control recipes that featured acacia, which modern studies have suggested to be an effective contraceptive. Many women, particularly those throughout Africa and the Americas, had a rich understanding of herbs and how to use them for contraception. Barrier methods were also common. In Northern Africa, for example, women used plugs of chopped grass or cloth to block the cervix, while women in Hungary used discs of melted beeswax. And women indigenous to various places in North America used the inner bark of birch trees to form diaphragms. In her book, The Moral Property of Women, historian Linda Gordon writes that there is a prevalent myth in our technological society that birth control technology came to us with modern medicine. This is far from the truth. Birth control was not invented by scientists or doctors. It is part of folk culture, and women's folklore in particular, in nearly all societies. And it wasn't until the 1800s when that really started to change. One reason for this is what makes it into the history books. As historian Dr. Ann Hippner-Koblitz writes, women's methods of sharing knowledge, mothers to daughters, midwives to women in labor, gossips at the village market, well, or church social, until recently have tended to be underappreciated by historians. And another major reason for this was the intentional interruption of women's birth control and reproductive knowledge in the 1800s. So at the time, midwives in the United States were primarily Black, Indigenous, and immigrant women. They helped deliver babies, but they also helped treat menstrual problems. And they had a good understanding of herbal medicine and knew how to use herbs to induce abortions or treat issues during pregnancy. But during the 1800s, white physicians who wanted to professionalize medicine and boost their status, as well as control the lucrative domain of gynecology, worked to take over the field from midwives. And this was really a hostile takeover. They organized professional societies, they published journals to help legitimize their authority, they worked with state legislators to pass licensing laws banning midwives from practicing, they launched PR campaigns disparaging midwives, and over the first few decades of the 1900s, midwives were outlawed, intimidated, and almost completely pushed out, at least legally speaking. And with that, a lot of birth control knowledge was obscured. Though I will say that for many women existing at the margins of mainstream society, this knowledge didn't disappear. It simply went underground. And so by the time the pill was coming onto the scene in the 1960s, it did seem like a novel thing for a lot of women at the time. So we have all these different factors. We have the incorrect but pervasive idea that the pill and other hormonal methods are the only effective methods we have and ever have had. We have the collective narrative that the pill itself was a catalyst for women's liberation. And we have this really fraught political moment that we are all currently living through. And because of this, a lot of birth control criticism gets written off as conservative misinformation. And for those who do value reproductive justice, there can be a real reluctance to say anything bad about hormonal birth control because of the way that anti-pill sentiment has come to be conflated with conservatism or with the pro-life movement. But if we trace the through line of history and of our current reality, we have to ask ourselves if this is justified. And importantly, who benefits and who gets hurt when we accept this mainstream narrative as fact. So when a lot of us think about the birth control movements, we likely think about chants of my body, my choice, campaigns for birth control destigmatization, and the fight for reproductive rights more broadly. And today it seems like a cornerstone of feminist thought and something that unites the majority of women. But looking deeper, this hasn't always been the case, and nor is it always the case now. So the modern birth control movement started in the late 1800s with the voluntary motherhood movement, which was an offshoot of the larger women's suffrage movement. And voluntary motherhood was essentially the practice of abstaining from sex with one's husband as a form of birth control. And this was happening at a time when there was a lot of puritanical, the culture in the United States was very puritanical, and contraception, which at the time were burial methods, herbal preparations, were outlawed. And so this movement was started by middle and upper class white women who thought that to achieve political equality, independent careers, and freedom, they needed control over their reproductive lives. But the government was not happy about this. In his 1906 State of the Union address, alarmed by the falling white birth rates, President Theodore Roosevelt scolded middle and upper class white women practicing abstinence, calling it, quote, the one sin for which the penalty is national death. So how did these women respond to his admonishments? Not by having more babies, but by using racist logic to their advantage. This reflected the larger suffrage movement at the time. Just as suffragettes were framing white women's voting rights as a way to uphold white political power, birth control advocates presented birth control as an antidote to the declining white population. The argument was, by introducing birth control to Black, immigrant, and poor women, wealthy white women could still maintain the relatively higher numbers. As Angela Davis puts it, class bias and racism crept into the birth control movement when it was still in its infancy. What was demanded as a right for the privileged came to be interpreted as a duty for the poor. So from the very start, the birth control movement was really only interested in issues faced by middle and upper class white women, and this dynamic would continue to play out. That said, there was a big difference between the birth control movement, which was a specific social movement that grew out of the suffragist movements, and contraceptive practices and advocacy for reproductive rights and care more generally. Though the birth control movement was overwhelmingly white and upper middle class, many of the most dedicated supporters of and activists for reproductive care and contraceptive access were Black, Indigenous, immigrant, and working class women. And these different groups had very different approaches and were grounded in very different ideologies. One of the clearest examples that we can see of this is in the responses to forced sterilizations. Throughout the 1900s, hundreds of thousands of forced sterilizations were done on mainly Black, Indigenous, and Puerto Rican women. And at the time that so many women were getting these hysterectomies without consent, it was nearly impossible for middle and upper class white women to find a doctor to give them a hysterectomy, and they didn't like this. In 1970, a group of women activists came together to form CESA, the Committee to End Sterilization Abuse, with the quoted aim of reducing sterilization violations against women of color in poverty. One major thing they did was introduce guidelines to the New York City Council designed to prevent sterilization abuse. They wanted three things. 1, informed consent in patients' preferred language. 2, a 3-day waiting period before the hysterectomy happened. And 3, a rule to prevent the practice of giving consent during labor or right after childbirth or abortion, which was very common at the time. But rather than forming a coalition and listening to the concerns of their fellow women, white birth control advocates who grew out of the voluntary motherhood movements view this as a roadblock to their desired aims of easily accessible birth control and actively campaigned against it. The National Abortion Rights Action League and Planned Parenthood both testified against the implementation of these guidelines. And ultimately, the guidelines did not pass, and many more coerced sterilizations continued to happen, and actually still happen, just in different ways. And this illustrates what happens and what gets obscured when we hyper-focus on birth control access and fail to take into account the needs, desires, and experiences of all women. So what were some of those experiences? So focusing back in on the pill, there were quite a few people involved in the creation of the pill. And although they worked together, they didn't necessarily have the same motivations. Some were interested in women's liberation, or at least a subset of women's liberation. But most were spurred to action by the idea of a simple, easily dispensable pharmaceutical solution to social and political problems. And though the people involved in the creation of the pill were overwhelmingly male, the actual process was, to a large extent, instigated by 2 women. The first was Margaret Sanger, who you likely know as the founder of Planned Parenthood, a lifelong birth control activist with strong ties to the eugenicist movements. And if you don't know, eugenics is the racist pseudoscience of controlling reproduction by encouraging white, wealthy people to have children and preventing people who don't fit into their warped and destructive vision of their ideal society from having them. Eugenics has been aimed at Black people, Indigenous people, disabled people, immigrants from everywhere, from Ireland to India, poor people, and a lot more. And one of the most well-known examples of eugenics at work is Nazi Germany, though its most influential thinkers have always been American. And in fact, Nazi Germany actually modeled their compulsory sterilization programs after the one enacted in California on Indigenous women. So the goalposts shift depending on when and where you are. And at the time, in the mid-1900s in America, eugenicists' policies primarily targeted Black, Indigenous, Puerto Rican, and poor working class women. And the second woman involved in the creation of the pill is Catherine McCormick, who you'll see at the bottom left of the screen here. She was a wealthy philanthropist who bankrolled their efforts. Both Sanger and McCormick were adamant about finding a form of contraception that did not depend on men's cooperation. And at the time, the primary form of contraception being practiced in mainstream America was burial methods, like condoms. And these had to be put on before sex, and they did necessitate the male partner's cooperation. Their dream was a solution that did not require this. So they set out to make this dream a reality. But first, they had to find a scientist to create such a pill. So they recruited Gregory Pincus, who was somewhat of a mad scientist type figure and had a reputation for forgoing ethics. And at the time, he was pretty much shunned by his peers for some pretty unethical tests that he had done previously. And so with funding from McCormick, Pincus and his team synthesized a hormonal compound that was able to stop ovulation in animals. He needed to be able to conduct human trials. So for this, he turned to OBGYN John Rock, a man who was explicitly interested in solving social problems with science. And next, all they needed were women to join these trials. After Rock joined Pincus, he initially found 60 women to volunteer to try the pill. Some of them were infertility patients at the Free Hospital for Women, while others were nurses at the Worcester State Hospital. The trials were complex, as the women had to undergo daily basal body temperature readings, vaginal smears and urine collection, as well as monthly endometrial biopsies. The initial results indicated that the pill worked. It inhibited ovulation, but their sample was quite small, and only about half of the women actually completed the lengthy protocols. They needed a large group of women to test the pill on, but finding a large group of willing participants was proving to be a challenge. And McCormick and some of the others were growing impatient, so they turned their focus towards involuntary subjects. The first group of unwilling women subjected to these trials were 15 psychiatric patients at the Worcester State Hospital. These women did not consent to being experimented on, nor did they have anything to gain by receiving these drugs, which came with a whole suite of unknown risks and side effects. Still, they needed an even larger group of women. And because at the time, contraception was still illegal in most of the United States, including Massachusetts, where they started looking elsewhere. And in 1956, they settled on the site of their first large-scale clinical trial, Puerto Rico. Rock, Pincus, and the others chose Puerto Rico for a few reasons. First, the laws around medicine were less restrictive than they were in the mainland US. Second, there were already established family planning clinics that had been operating in Puerto Rico since the 1930s, funded by the US government with eugenicist aims. And finally, there was a widespread and intense racism towards Puerto Ricans, and they may have thought that because of this, there would be less scrutiny towards their unethical trials. So they began a large-scale trial in the Rio Piedra neighborhood of San Juan, and this trial involved 256 women, all of whom volunteered to take the pill, but who were not told that this was an experimental drug, and they were not told that they were participants in a trial. So during the trials, the women were given pills containing 10 milligrams of progesterone and small amounts of estrogen, which is significantly higher than today's pills. 22% of the 256 women dropped out of the study due to severe side effects like nausea, dizziness, and headaches, as well as the invasive testing they were required to undergo. One of the lead nurses working on the trial was actually very concerned and tried to persuade Rock and Pincus to end the study. But they dismissed her concerns, and Pincus even asserted that the majority of the women's symptoms were psychosomatic, which they were not. And ultimately, 3 of the women in the Puerto Rico trials died, presumably from complications from taking the pill. A year later, in 1957, additional large-scale trials were conducted in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, Mexico City, Mexico, and in poor communities in New York and Massachusetts. In total, data from nearly 900 women was collected and submitted by John Rock to the FDA. The FDA approved Inovid, their pill, in 1960 as an oral contraceptive, and it became the first drug in history to be given to healthy individuals for long-term daily use. And by 1962, over 1 million women were using the pill. Something that really illustrates how these women were used and then disregarded is that after the Puerto Rico trials ended, the pills were much too expensive for many of the women to afford, so they couldn't even access the pills they themselves made possible. These women were also not compensated, either for their participation in the study or for the harms it caused many of them. Meanwhile, GD Searle, the pharmaceutical company behind Inovid, made $37 million annually. A couple years later, in 1965, they saw $89 million in sales, which is nearly $730 million today. But not everyone was happy once the pill was out. While many women were excited about the pill, many others were hesitant, especially after the reports of the negative health outcomes started to surface. The first report of blood clotting in a woman taking the pill came in 1961. The following year, there were 26 more reports of the same. 6 of these women died, and soon it was clear that the pill increased women's risk of blood clots. But it wasn't just blood clots. There were also reports of strokes and even suicide. And then there were the side effects, as women on the pill were experiencing headaches, nausea, weight gain, loss of libido, and depression. By the end of the 1960s, the second wave feminist movement was gaining momentum, and many in the movement were concerned about birth control. In 1969, journalist and women's health activist Barbara Seaman released her hugely influential and controversial book, The Doctor's Case Against the Pill. It included research and reports on blood clots and other health risks, interviews with doctors, and testimonies from women regarding their experience of side effects. And many people found her book persuasive, among them being Senator Gaylord Nelson, who had a reputation for being critical of big business as well as pharmaceutical companies. So after reading her book, Nelson calls for hearings on oral contraception. The Nelson pill hearings, as they came to be called, began in January 1970 and were hugely publicized. Several of the doctors quoted in Seaman's book testified, among others. Yet not a single woman spoke during the hearings, and women's health activists were really upset about this. The feminist group DC Women's Liberation protested at the hearings and were captured on camera in footage broadcast widely. As they sat in the audience, they shouted, "Why are you using women as guinea pigs? Why are you letting drug companies murder us for their profit and convenience?" When told by Senator Nelson to sit down and remain quiet, they shouted, "We are not going to sit quietly. We do not think the hearings are more important than our lives." None of them were given an actual opportunity to speak, but their protest did end up being hugely consequential. And as a result of the hearings, the FDA required pharmaceutical manufacturers to include an information sheet detailing potential side effects and health risks alongside every packet of pills. And that's that infamous info sheet that's now included alongside all prescription medications. It's actually a result of the pill hearing protests. So zooming out, when the pill was developed, the United States was in the middle of a Cold War with the Soviet Union. The political landscape was shifting rapidly post-World War II, and it was capitalism versus communism, and the American empire needed capitalism to win. The government was worried that communism would take hold in the global south, in part due to population growth, and they feared it would weaken their position as a superpower. And domestically, the nation was in the midst of social, political, and sexual revolution. Many saw the pill as a, quote, magic bullet that would avert the explosion of a, quote, population bomb. Reducing the population would, they argued, alleviate poverty and unrest that would cause people to turn towards communism and away from capitalism. The stated focus of the birth control movement at this time was the idea that couples should be able to plan their families and that nations should be able to plan their populations. Family planning advocates sought to position birth control as a rational, scientific method to ensure the safety and security of a nation. The pill was initially only available to married women, and advocates argued that it would free married couples from fears of unwanted pregnancy, allow them to build strong families once they were economically prepared, and therefore foster happy nuclear families and encourage more women to get married. And again, this was a time of a lot of political and social activism in the US, so the government was worried that women wouldn't want to get married and that they would lose that traditional nuclear family. And the majority of the pill's most vocal advocates focus entirely on the pill's effects on maintaining the social order. In a lot of ways, the widespread support of the pill, especially amongst powerful men, was driven largely because it was presented as a tool to pacify potentially unruly citizens, both in America and abroad. And in its initial conception, it wasn't a tool to liberate women, but to preserve American imperialism and the white middle and upper class nuclear family. In the latter decades of the 1900s, the pill had raked in tens of millions of dollars, and other pharmaceutical companies were taking note, pouring resources into developing contraceptive technologies as their own. Now, at the time, the US government and a number of wealthy foundations were taking note of how birth control technologies could be used to further the agenda of population control. When the pill was being developed, the government was wary. It was too controversial, and so they left the development of the pill to be funded by wealthy donors like Catherine McCormick, as well as private pharmaceutical companies, because they didn't want it to appear as if they were supporting it. But by 1979, that had changed, and the US government had paid for over 70% of the world's contraceptive research. The government also worked closely with and helped fund a number of private organizations and foundations. The most notable probably being the Population Council, which was a nonprofit founded in 1952 by John Rockefeller III, and that was established with help from one of America's most prominent eugenicists, who explicitly stated that birth control was one of the most promising means for carrying out eugenicist aims, and that these aims would be much more successful if they were carried out in the name of population control rather than eugenics. So in the United States, domestically, contraception, including sterilization, hysterectomy, and the pill, was being used as a tool of oppression under the guise of social welfare. And abroad, it was being increasingly used as so-called humanitarian aid, but really it was being used to try to strengthen the United States' control over the rest of the world. And while the government and these agencies were sending birth control abroad, they were also developing new birth control technologies, and they were learning as they went. They were seeing that they were having trouble getting women, both in the US and elsewhere, to take the pill every day, and that many women were rightfully skeptical. So they focused on creating something longer lasting, something with, quote, low user responsibility that didn't require the women's daily cooperation. So they set to work on creating long-acting contraceptives, which we know is the IUD, the implant, the shot, yeah, Depo as well. And one of the first contraceptives that the Population Council developed was the Norplant implants. They also developed the popular Mirena IUD, which people still commonly get. The Norplant was a contraceptive implant that consisted of 6 silicone capsules filled with synthetic progesterone, each roughly the size of a matchstick, that were surgically implanted into a woman's upper arm. Norplant was first rolled out in Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Peru, among other places, and the so-called public health programs used to promote them were by and large coercive. Some women reported receiving incentives in exchange for having it put in. In other cases, women could only get certain jobs or social benefits if they had Norplants. And once Norplant was put in, so many of them found it nearly impossible to get it taken out. And this coercive nature of Norplant also played out in the United States. Now, there's so much more to the story than can be contained in this presentation, and I go a lot more in depth into it in the Chaos and Control podcast. But for now, what you should know is that Norplant was approved by the FDA in late 1990. And at the time of its release, Norplant was hailed as the biggest contraceptive breakthrough since the pill. It lasted for 5 years. Women didn't have to remember to take a pill every day or to stop to bother with condoms or diaphragms. And it was 99% effective. So effective that some called it a form of temporary sterilization. Every state, as well as DC, quickly made Norplant available through Medicaid. Several states passed legislation that required women receiving public assistance to receive written notification of the state's offer for free Norplant insertion. By 1994, the government had spent $34 million on Norplant programs. And data from Planned Parenthood at the time found that although only 12% of its clients were on Medicaid, 95 to 100% of women implanted with Norplant at many of its clinics were on Medicaid. And it was being pushed at the exact same time that other welfare benefits were being rolled back. As Dorothy Roberts notes, the government was willing to pay for a woman's Norplants, but not for her basic needs. So the media and policymakers at the time all asserted that Norplant was safe, but as it turned out, that wasn't true. A 1995 report found that 95% of the women in the large-scale Norplant trials had at least one side effect. 80% experienced menstrual changes, 24% experienced severe headaches, 16% experienced mood changes, and so on. And these side effects caused a third of the women implanted with Norplant to seek removal within the first year. And within the first 3 years, that number rose to half. But many of these women faced obstacles to removal. Medicaid had covered the cost of insertion. However, Medicaid did not cover the cost of early removal. The procedure was covered, however, if the woman waited the full 5 years. So in some cases, the women who wanted it out early were told that they would not only have to pay for the full cost of removal, but they'd also have to reimburse Medicaid for the initial insertion, and that could be up to $1,000. Moreover, many doctors were unwilling to remove the implants early, or there were just no appointments available to do so. The removal process was lengthy, and disturbingly, many doctors were also unable to do so. Like they literally didn't receive the training for how to safely take the implants out. So by design, Norplant is controlled by the doctor, not the woman. Unlike the pill, a woman can't just stop taking it. And because of this, it was uniquely suited to be a tool for control. Because of all of the side effects and some deaths, Norplant distribution in the United States ended in 2002, with limited supplies remaining until 2004. But the same tactics and ideas continue to play out in other contraceptives, like Depo, which, unlike the Norplants, cannot be removed once injected, and which is still used today. Depo is notorious for horrible side effects and risks, with more and more being revealed each year, which is very significant considering that in the US, nearly a quarter of sexually active women have used Depo at some point in their life. It also comes with really serious long-term health risks. But despite this, it has been given to millions of women, both in the US and elsewhere, often without fully informed consent, and in many cases in a coercive way. Just one of many examples. In 2013, a report came out revealing that thousands of Ethiopian women had been receiving regular shots of Depo at Israeli clinics without consent. And this was uncovered when social workers noticed that the birth rate of Ethiopian immigrant women in Israel had halved in just a decade. According to The Guardian, women were started on a course of contraceptives while still in transit camps from Ethiopia, some without being told they were being given birth control, and many having no ideas of the side effects. One woman believed that she was being given a flu vaccine. Another woman said she agreed to be injected only because she was told her immigration to Israel would be blocked and she would receive no further health care if she refused. Currently, Depo is still a popular component of family planning programs in places throughout Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia. In the US, throughout the 90s and 2000s, Depo was continually given to American women, most often in low-cost clinics and in schools with high populations of Black students. Again, despite the fact that Depo has been shown over and over again to be carcinogenic and to come with horrible side effects, especially when given to young girls. And according to the most recent data I've been able to find, Depo is still more commonly prescribed to Black and Indigenous women than it is to white women. Depo use is also nearly 3 times as common amongst women without a high school diploma compared to women with a bachelor's degree. So, what does all of this mean? While the pill and other hormonal contraceptives were being used in really harmful and oppressive ways, they were also paradoxically developing a reputation as a tool of empowerment. And this was in large part due to marketing. In the late 1900s and the early 2000s, the pill was increasingly prescribed for other hormonal conditions, like menstrual cramps and acne that had nothing to do with contraception. And today, about 50% of pill prescriptions don't have to do with contraception. The idea of birth control around this time started to become more normalized, and cultural ideas around menstruation and around gender in general started to shift. And as a result, pharmaceutical companies and medical professionals increasingly rebranded the pill as hormonal regulation. And in promoting this idea, pharmaceutical companies increasingly co-opted feminist language to promote their new drugs. So in the decades after the pill, many feminists were highly critical of it and its effects on women's bodies. But around this time, the early 2000s, this was shifting. One big cause of the shift was the rise of the far right and their war on abortion. So before Roe v. Wade, there actually wasn't any organized anti-abortion movement in the United States. But soon after Roe was passed, the National Conference of Catholic Bishops created a pro-life legal affairs committee dedicated to getting anti-abortion candidates elected. And then in 1974, the National Right to Life Committee was founded. Over the years, these groups organized and lobbied, and conservative Christians, largely drawing on pro-life sentiments, increasingly gained political power. And the Republican Party progressively became the pro-life party as they capitalized on the conservative Christian voting bloc, and as more conservative Christians became politically active. And at the turn of the century, the far-right movement was really beginning to coalesce. The Patriot movement, Christian nationalists, the then fledgling Tea Party, and all of the various groups that eventually became the alt-right movement all started to gain power and influence around this time. And this was all spurred even further with the election of George W. Bush, who made abortion restrictions a big part of his platform. So all of this caused birth control and abortion to become increasingly polarized issues. And as opposition to birth control and abortion increased in both presence and fervor, many feminists shifted towards contraception and towards the pharmaceutical companies who were increasingly profiting off of contraceptives. They also shifted towards the medical establishments, who offered some measure of justification for hormonal contraceptives that could be used as an argument against the far right. If hormonal contraceptives were used for things other than contraception, for cramps and acne and regulating one's cycle, for example, if they became an essential aspect of women's healthcare, that made them appear more legitimate, especially in an environment where women were still labeled as sluts for premarital sex, for example. And it was within this social and political landscape that criticism of the pill was increasingly being seen as a conservative thing. Contraceptives were also making a lot of money, and pharmaceutical companies were taking note. In the early 2000s, there was a concerted push to present birth control as a lifestyle drug, often while using the language of empowerment. So one really clear example of this is Seasonique, a contraceptive where you only bleed 4 times a year. Seasonique was marketed as a solution to the messy, inconvenient problem of menstruation. A natural process that the menstruating body experienced was thus transformed into a problem to be fixed. And this idea that a menstruating body that experiences cyclical hormonal shifts and bleeds once a month is problematic, and that we can fix this problem by turning to contraception as a solution or as a savior, has built and shaped a lot of our current birth control discourse. Because the way that the medical system treats women's bodies and ignores our pain, and the way that we have come to see menstruation as a problem to be managed, both on a personal and collective level, the pill has become a mainstay in so many women's lives, even as they struggle with the negative effects of taking it. And this is able to happen in part also because the knowledge that ovulation and menstruation are important aspects of health is denied or dismissed to the extent that we don't even understand what we are consenting to when we take the pill. It's the result of a number of different factors: menstrual stigma, medical neglects, and the industrial urge to optimize the body and transcend the natural. And this primes us to accept medical intervention as an answer to all of our period-related problems, even when those interventions aren't necessary at all, when we don't want them, or when there are better options that would better serve our overall health and well-being. And it keeps us from being able to have fully informed conversations about the pill and about the many ways that it has been used and misused. There is a long history of birth control being presented as the solution to a variety of social problems not caused by women's fertility, but by oppressive social systems. We've seen a little bit of how contraceptives have been used as a tool of racial violence, of Western imperialism, and of maintaining social control. We've seen how various forms of contraception have been used to make rich pharmaceutical companies even richer, often at the expense of the women involved. And we've seen how contraceptives are used as stopgaps in a system that can't be bothered to take women's well-being seriously and find real solutions. And it's tempting to think of all of this as just history or just some things in the past. But all of this history we've been talking about has literally built our current reality and shaped our current conversation. And in all of these instances, the problem isn't necessarily the pill itself or the IUD itself or the implants. It's the broken systems and the ways of thinking that gave rise to these contraceptive technologies. It's the mechanistic view of the body rooted in white supremacy, the normalization of reproductive violence, especially against Black and Indigenous women. It's the ideology that prioritizes profit above all else, the oppressive system that coerces women into taking on all the responsibility for preventing pregnancy. And it's a system that listens to a woman saying that she's suffering with her period and then exclusively offers her something that not only won't address the cause of that suffering, but could very likely make it worse. So when we're working to promote body literacy and fertility awareness, it's not as simple as swapping out pills for thermometers and cycle charts. And in order to have a truly just approach to birth control, we need to reimagine those systems, and we need to shift our entire cultural narrative around contraception and around women's bodies and reproductive health in general. And a big part of that is taking an honest and clear-eyed look at the history that got us here. So this was just a small bit of what is a much larger story, much larger than can be contained in a hour-long presentation. I covered all of these ideas in a lot more in-depth in Chaos and Control, which is available to stream on Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you would like to dive deeper. You can find the links and sources and so much more at moonbeambysabrina.com, but you can also scan this QR code here on the screen, which will take you there. It features interviews with some really brilliant sociologists, historians, doulas, and body literacy educators, including Nicole. And you'll see a couple of the others here on the screen. So now I'm going to take a minute to pause and reflect on this history. And whenever you're ready, I would open it up to questions and reflections and what you're left sitting with after what we just talked about. I saw there was a lot of chats as well as I was talking. Oh, Denise said I had to travel to Colombia to get my implant taken out. That's crazy. Catherine says, thinking about the fibroids presentation earlier, where Kate talked about how exposure to excess estrogen in utero has been linked to developing fibroids later in life, and Black women are more at risk for developing fibroids, really makes me think about the possibilities of long-term and intergenerational consequences of this coercion and violence. Yeah. It is really fucked up.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. I really appreciate this entire talk. And obviously, we've talked about this at length on your podcast. I recommend everyone go check out Chaos and Control. I guess the question that I had was about the most effective communication strategies for having these like more meaningful or more nuanced conversations about birth control. What has been your experience making this podcast and talking to people out in the world about birth control? Have you been able to successfully break through that sort of impulse to defend, access and the pill and all of that? How's that been for you on an interpersonal level?
I think it's been really interesting. It's something that is so charged, so emotionally charged. And I understand why it is. I understand, why there's also such like a knee-jerk reaction to defending the pill. But I think it's because a lot of people just don't have the full story. And I think backing up and starting with starting with beliefs and just really grounding in, okay, we're both committed to women's health. We're both committed to reproductive justice, to liberation. Let's build on that. In the podcast, so one of the people I interviewed was Dr. Crystal Littlejohn, who is such a brilliant sociologist, and she's written some really amazing books. And I kind of asked her a similar question: how do you go about critiquing the pill and having these conversations about people misunderstanding you? And she said, and it's in the podcast too, I think it's in episode 6, if anyone's interested in hearing her full quote, because it was much better than my what I'm about to say. But she said something along the lines of, you have to just make it really clear what you believe, and the people that get it will get it, and, go with you on that conversation. And the people that are committed to misunderstanding you will always be committed to misunderstanding you no matter what. Alex says, how do you bring this up to fellow liberal/leftist friends who think you're coming from a mega/conservative place when it's actually the exact opposite? Yeah, I think it's really going back to first principles, really going back to just starting with what you believe, starting with why you believe what you believe, starting with the underlying ideology of it, and then going from there. Because starting with, the pill is bad is going to lead to probably some misunderstandings. And again, like something that I try to emphasize a lot when I'm talking about this is I'm actually not making an argument about whether or not we should be taking the pill. I'm not actually trying to make an argument about, whether the pill is good or bad. I want to more so just contextualize and understand how, the history of the pill and the marketing and all this different stuff has played into our beliefs about the pill, and just look at how the different ways it's been used. Because again, it's there's precedent. There's a lot of historical precedent. We talked about a couple instances in the presentation, but the one that I just think about a lot is the guidelines to stop sterilization abuse in the 70s. And the reason that those didn't pass, the reason that, we didn't do more to address that is because at the time, the white feminist birth control activists who did at the time, they considered themselves very liberal, they were second wave feminists, were so committed to just thinking we have to preserve access, and just so much gets left out of the conversation. So I also think taking it back to history and making parallels between historical events and our current events is also helpful. Abigail says, I'm curious about short and long-term side effects of historical herbal birth control, especially considering the previous conversations on ovulation and bone density. So yeah, this is definitely outside of the realm of my topic for this particular presentation, but a lot of herbal birth control is not actually, doesn't actually, so a lot of hormonal birth control, I mean, not all hormonal birth control, stops you from ovulating. That's how it works. But a lot of herbal birth control is actually works a little bit differently. It's they work as like implantation inhibitors, or they disrupt fertilization. So a lot of the time when we're working with herbs, we're not actually stopping ovulation. We're addressing the pregnancy at a different part of the process. There are some herbs like Queen Anne's lace that can disrupt ovulation, but there are a lot of nuances there. And I think that we, the best, as an herbalist, I think that the best use of herbs is in conjunction with cycle tracking and as like kind of like a backup. I know Nicole talks a lot about this too, but like as a backup to like if you have an oops, if you're tracking, so you're aware of, this could potentially get me pregnant. Is there anything that I can work with? Because I just made it, just had an oops or something. But rather than relying on herbs as like a primary birth control.
And I also wanted to bring up Christelle Littlejohn again, because first off, the book, Just Get on the Pill, it's brilliantly written. And she's also a great orator, I've noticed too. Like she's able to really express herself and explain very well this complicated subject. But I wanted you to touch on her point of her book, which is about this uneven burden of birth control. How birth control is gendered, and then secondly, how it's pretty much the burden is all on us to actually prevent the pregnancy and make sure that the contraceptive of choice is actually being used in all this. So when that is the case, when we have this uneven burden on us, how does that affect our ability to gain body literacy if we constantly sort of are going through this coercive process with birth control technologies? How do we actually make informed decisions about our reproductive health when that uneven burden is like a material reality for us that we're constantly dealing with? And with the way that the pill technology works, it seems to really block a lot of our body literacy. So I'm curious what you kind of think of that, and Christelle's a point in her book.
Yeah, one thing she talks about that's really interesting is the idea that contraceptive effectiveness is socially constructed. And what she means by that is that contraceptives are only effective as effective as they are, because women, the woman who taking them commits to taking them and takes on that burden, including all of the negative side effects and health risks. And so, when we're talking about, oh, the pill is better because it's 99.6 whatever percent effective, so, and a more effective equals better, what we're, saying, like, that effectiveness is only because a woman is committed to taking it every single day and committed to, shutting off her ovulation and everything that comes along with that. Another thing that she talks about a lot is how social location affects our experience of birth control, and how a lot of women are socialized to just have the mindset that they need to do the most effective form of birth control because that's what's responsible, and they need to be responsible, and the responsibility is all on them. And then they get punished socially, whatever, for not taking on that responsibility. And I mean, we see that a lot, like in, for example, the response to teen moms, response to women who get pregnant unexpectedly, and so forth. And I think just recognizing just that the part about it being that contraceptive effectiveness being socially constructed is really key, and just also the idea of breaking down the idea of responsibility and reframing the idea of responsibility, and trusting women. Another thing that we spoke about in the podcast, I believe it was in episode 6, if anyone wants to go back and listen, but how if we can reframe the idea of being responsible, and reframe the idea of reframe the idea of responsibility, and just of how we talk about which contraceptives are the best, because a lot of what drives the conversation, at least mainstream, about which contraceptives are the best, and we see this a lot also, like in the articles I was referencing in the beginning, why do people disparage fertility awareness so much and so forth, is because, oh, it's not as effective, and we just kind of reframe that and think, well, maybe what's most effective is what allows a woman to live in the way that she wants to, and to have the relationship and experience of her body that she wants to. That's really what is the most effective and responsible.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that is totally congruent with my own experience of using birth control, and not necessarily knowing any of this while going into the experience of using it, but knowing coming out of the experience of using it that it wasn't effective for me because I couldn't sustain to continue using it. So it wouldn't have been very effective because I could no longer use it based on how it was affecting my health. So what became most effective for me, it was another method. And so, yeah, that was all, not revealed to me at the time, but I definitely resonate with that. And the history too. Once you really learn the history, I felt more confident in the fact that, okay, maybe this product was not just simply like the invention of fellow feminists, and was, purely for our empowerment and liberation. When I came out of the experience of using it, and I read the history, I was like, this makes so much more sense about why our needs and our side effects, why none of that's really mentioned to us, and why there are elements of coercion and how you're supposed to accept those things. So thank you so much for this.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions here for Sabrina?
Hi, Sabrina. Thanks so much for today's presentation and sharing everything that you've been researching. I was wondering, as you were gathering information, did you see anything about how the pill was being developed in the rest of the Western world, like the UK specifically? Because I think it came over here a little bit later, and if there was any connection, because I remember you mentioning how the Germans took some inspiration from the sterilization programs in the US.
Yeah, it's kind of similar in terms of the UK specifically. They really kind of followed suits from the Americans. I'm not as familiar with, for example, if there was a history of like a legacy of forced sterilizations. But I know that there was the pills used in similar ways, and there's similar statistics about how Depo was used, for example. It was used similarly in the UK and in other Western countries, in France as well, for example. Yeah, but the US really exported that to a lot of the Western world, just the ideas, and as well as the tactics and techniques, and as well as domestically, like abroad as well. Like the US collaborated a lot with the UK in terms of like the population control agendas and humanitarian aid sent to the global south.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
I also find that in my work, that when I work with people from other countries and other parts of the world, that their experiences of gynecology are like remarkably similar. So they say the same things and they're told the same things. And it does feel like there's sort of a global standardized protocol at this point around these issues. So they're kind of all speaking in unison about, what the standards are, what's most effective, and that kind of thing. So it seems to surprise people the same, no matter where they're from, when they learn about this kind of information and about other alternatives.
Mm-hmm. There's one contraceptive, I don't actually remember what it is. I talk about it more in the podcast. That was actually approved by the UK's version of the FDA before it was approved by the US's version. It might have been Depo. I don't think it was. I think it was a different one. And it actually, I think it was a Norplant implant IUD, and I didn't talk about IUDs in this presentation. It's also a huge topic. This has also a similar history, and I talk about it in the podcast too, I think episode 4. But it played out in the UK in similarly disastrous ways. Yeah, Denise says, unfortunately, the US sets the standards. And they outsource, they export a lot of their oppression.
Well, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for, your time and for sharing this with us and laying out more about what is in the podcast. I highly recommend checking out Chaos and Control. There's a lot of good talk in there that digs even deeper to these details. So thank you so much, Sabrina, and thanks everyone for coming to the Body Literacy Symposium. It's truly been an honor to host this event.
Yes, thank you. Oh, did someone just raise their hands? I didn't see who it was, but.
I just wanted to say this has been absolutely amazing to everyone involved. I'm so glad that I happened upon this event and was able to attend both days. It's been absolutely amazing. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, for organizing it.
It's my pleasure.